The atmosphere within the observation deck of the deep space vessel Vanguard of Sol was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic tang of ionized particles. Outside the reinforced viewport, the vast expanse of the void stretched toward infinity, a canvas of deep violet and obsidian speckled with the cold, distant light of dying stars. Commander Valerius Thorne stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the anomaly that had pulled them from their charted course. It was a jagged tear in the fabric of spacetime, a shimmering rift that pulsed with an unsettling, pale luminescence. Behind him, the bridge crew worked in a rhythmic, focused cadence, the soft hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic tapping of tactile interfaces providing the only soundtrack to their vigil. They were far beyond the charted territories of the United Terran hegemony, deep within the silent reaches where no human had set foot for a century. The anomaly was not natural. Its geometric precision and the rhythmic fluctuations of its energy output suggested a deliberate, artificial origin. Valerius knew that they were potentially facing a first contact scenario, or perhaps something far more dangerous. His thoughts drifted to the history of his kind, to the stories of how humanity had clawed its way out of the gravity well of their home world, surviving wars, famine, and the collapse of their early orbital colonies. They were a species defined by their refusal to break, by an inherent stubbornness that had turned a fragile biological race into the masters of their solar system and beyond. Now, that same stubbornness was leading them into the unknown, toward a mystery that could redefine their place in the cosmos. A junior officer, Ensign Merck, approached Valerius with a digital slate, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. The data on the screen showed a series of complex gravitational readings that defied standard physical models. The rift was not just a hole in space, it was a doorway, and something on the other side was pulling at the very foundations of their reality. Valerius took the slate, his fingers brushing against the cold glass. He studied the numbers, the way the curves of the gravitational waves spiked and then flattened in a pattern that almost looked like a heartbeat. It was a signal, a massive, cosmic-scale beacon that had been dormant for eons until their arrival. The ship's artificial intelligence, a sophisticated network of neural pathways known as Aegis, chimed in his ear, its voice a calm, modulated resonance. Aegis confirmed that the energy signatures matched the theoretical models of the ancient precursors, a mythic civilization that supposedly vanished before the first primates had learned to use tools. If this was indeed a precursor site, the implications were staggering. The technology within could propel humanity forward by millennia, or it could unleash a force that would wipe them from existence. Valerius looked back at the rift, the pale light reflecting in his eyes. He felt a surge of that old, primal curiosity, the same drive that had sent the first explorers across the oceans of Earth. They could not turn back. They were humans, and they were built to find out what lay on the other side of the horizon. The Vanguard began its slow, methodical approach toward the anomaly, its hull groaning under the increasing gravitational pressure. Valerius ordered the activation of the inertial dampeners and the reinforcement of the forward shields. He could feel the vibration in the soles of his boots, a low-frequency shudder that seemed to resonate with his very bones. As they drew closer, the rift began to expand, its edges fraying into long, luminous ribbons of energy that lashed out like the tentacles of some celestial beast. The stars behind it distorted, bending into strange, elongated shapes as the light was pulled into the singularity. Valerius watched as the bridge displays began to flicker, the sensor data becoming a chaotic jumble of noise and interference. Aegis reported that the ship's primary systems were being subjected to a massive electromagnetic pulse, yet the Vanguard held steady. The vessel was a testament to human engineering, built with a redundancy and durability that assumed the worst-case scenario at every turn. It was not elegant, nor was it particularly fast, but it was sturdy. It was a fortress of steel and ceramic composites designed to endure the harshest environments the universe could throw at it. This was the hallmark of human design, a refusal to prioritize form over function, a commitment to survival above all else. As the ship crossed the threshold of the rift, the world outside the viewport vanished into a blinding flash of white light. For a moment, Valerius felt a sensation of weightlessness, as if his body were being stretched and compressed simultaneously. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the turbulence ceased. The Vanguard emerged into a pocket of space that defied all known astronomical laws. They were inside a massive, artificial Dyson sphere, the interior surface of which was covered in a sprawling, metallic metropolis that glowed with a soft, amber radiance. A central star, small and white-hot, hung in the exact center of the sphere, providing light and heat to the impossible world. The scale of the construction was beyond comprehension, a structure so vast that it could house trillions of sentient beings. Yet, as the Vanguard's sensors swept the surface, they found no signs of life. No radio signals, no heat plumes from industrial centers, no movement in the massive transit tubes that crisscrossed the city. It was a ghost world, a monument to a civilization that had reached the pinnacle of technological achievement and then simply ceased to be. Valerius felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The silence of the sphere was more deafening than any explosion. It was the silence of the grave on a galactic scale. Valerius called for a meeting of the senior staff in the briefing room. He looked at the faces of his officers, men and women who had spent their lives preparing for a moment like this. There was Sarah, the chief engineer, whose hands were stained with grease and whose mind was a labyrinth of mechanical solutions. There was Cale, the science officer, whose eyes were wide with the sheer intellectual magnitude of their discovery. And there was Commander Jackson, the head of security, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as the ship itself. Valerius laid out the situation. They were trapped inside a precursor megastructure with no clear way to reopen the rift from the inside. Their primary mission was now twofold: to understand the nature of this place and to find a way home. He emphasized the importance of caution. They were in an environment where the laws of physics were merely suggestions and where any misstep could lead to catastrophe. But he also spoke of the opportunity. They were the first humans to see the interior of a Dyson sphere, the first to witness the heights to which a civilization could soar. They carried the torch of human ambition into this dark, forgotten corner of the universe, and they would not let it flicker out. The first expeditionary team was assembled, consisting of Valerius, Sarah, and a squad of security personnel. They would take a shuttle down to the surface of the sphere, targeting a central spire that appeared to be the primary control hub for the entire structure. As the shuttle descended, Valerius looked out at the city below. The architecture was alien, characterized by sweeping curves and soaring arches that seemed to defy gravity. There were no sharp corners, no harsh lines. Everything was smooth, polished, and perfectly integrated. It was a stark contrast to the utilitarian aesthetic of the Vanguard. It was a world built by beings who had transcended the need for survival and had instead focused on the pursuit of beauty and harmony. But even beauty had its limits. As they landed on a wide, elevated plaza at the base of the central spire, Valerius noticed the signs of decay. The amber glow of the buildings was flickering in places, and some of the smaller structures had collapsed into piles of iridescent dust. The sphere was dying, its power failing after untold millions of years. They were scavengers in a cathedral, picking through the remains of a god. Stepping out onto the surface, Valerius felt a strange sensation in the air. It was not quite wind, but a subtle movement of energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. The gravity was slightly higher than Earth's, giving him a sense of solidity and purpose. The air was breathable, though it had a dry, sterile quality to it. Sarah immediately began deploying a series of sensor drones, their small, circular forms buzzing as they mapped the immediate area. Jackson and his team fanned out, their rifles held at the ready, though there was nothing to shoot at. The plaza was empty, save for a series of large, crystalline pillars that rose from the ground like frozen geysers. These pillars pulsed with a faint, blue light, and as Valerius approached one, he saw complex patterns etched deep within the crystal. It was a form of data storage, a library of information that had survived the passage of eons. He reached out and touched the cool surface of the crystal, and for a fleeting second, he felt a surge of images and emotions flood his mind. He saw the rise of the Precursors, their exploration of the galaxy, and their eventual realization that they were alone in a universe that was vast, cold, and indifferent. He felt their loneliness, their longing for connection, and their ultimate decision to build this sanctuary as a testament to their existence. The connection was broken as Sarah called out to him. She had found a way into the central spire, a massive portal that had partially opened as they approached. The interior of the spire was a hollow shaft that extended upward for miles, filled with floating platforms and shimmering energy conduits. At the very center of the shaft was a massive, glowing orb of light, the heart of the Dyson sphere's power grid. Sarah pointed to a console near the base of the orb, its surface covered in the same crystalline patterns they had seen on the pillars. She believed that if they could interface with the console, they might be able to restart the sphere's auxiliary systems and find a way to reopen the rift. But there was a catch. The power levels were critically low, and any attempt to draw energy could trigger a total system failure. It was a gamble, the kind of high-stakes risk that had defined human history from the discovery of fire to the invention of warp drive. Valerius looked at his team, then back at the glowing orb. He knew what he had to do. He gave the order to proceed. As Sarah began the delicate process of interfacing with the precursor technology, the spire began to vibrate. The blue light of the crystalline pillars intensified, turning into a brilliant, blinding azure. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone, and the sound of the energy conduits increased to a deafening roar. Valerius watched as the bridge displays on his portable slate began to populate with data, a torrent of information that Aegis struggled to process. He saw maps of the galaxy, coordinates for hidden caches of technology, and the history of 1,000 worlds that had never known the touch of humanity. But amidst the data, he also saw a warning. The sphere was not empty because its creators had moved on. It was empty because they had been hunted. A shadow was moving through the data, a dark, predatory force that had pursued the precursors across the stars. This force was still out there, lurking in the depths of the void, and the activation of the sphere's power grid had just sent a signal across the cosmos. They had not just found a treasure trove, they had walked into a trap that had been set millions of years ago. The realization hit Valerius like a physical blow. They were not alone, and they were not safe. He ordered Sarah to cease the interface immediately, but it was too late. The system was already in a feedback loop, drawing power from the central star at an accelerating rate. The spire shook with the force of a tectonic shift, and a massive beam of energy erupted from the top of the tower, punching through the atmosphere of the sphere and into the central star itself. The white-hot orb began to pulse, its light turning from a steady glow to a frantic, stuttering strobe. Outside, the city began to wake up. Lights flickered to life in the long dark buildings, and the transit tubes began to hum with the movement of ancient, automated systems. But it was not a rebirth, it was a death rattle. The sphere was consuming itself to fuel the signal, a desperate, final cry for help that had been programmed into its core. Valerius grabbed Sarah by the arm and pulled her toward the shuttle. They had to get back to the Vanguard and find a way out before the entire structure collapsed. As they scrambled into the shuttle and roared away from the spire, Valerius looked back at the city. The amber glow was being replaced by a harsh, red light as the power systems began to overload. Explosions ripped through the sprawling metropolis, sending debris hurtling into the air. The beautiful, sweeping arches were crumbling, their elegant curves snapping under the strain of the energy surge. It was a tragic sight, the destruction of a masterwork of alien art, but Valerius had no time for mourning. His focus was entirely on his crew and his ship. The Vanguard was already under fire from the sphere's automated defense systems, which had mistaken the human vessel for the ancient enemy they were designed to fight. Massive beams of coherent light lashed out from the surface, striking the Vanguard's shields with the force of 1,000 suns. The ship groaned, its hull plating glowing red-hot as it absorbed the punishment. Valerius reached the bridge and took command, his voice steady and calm despite the chaos. He ordered the ship to engage its primary thrusters and head for the rift, which was beginning to reappear in the center of the sphere, triggered by the massive energy output of the spire. The journey to the rift was a gauntlet of fire and destruction. The Vanguard dodged through clouds of debris and weaved between the beams of the defense towers, its engines screaming at maximum output. Jackson and his security teams worked tirelessly to repair the damage to the internal systems, while Sarah and the engineering crew fought to keep the reactor from melting down. They were pushed to their absolute limits, their bodies battered by the G-forces and their minds strained by the sheer intensity of the combat. But they did not falter. They were humans, and they were at their best when the odds were stacked against them. They found strength in their shared purpose, in the knowledge that they were fighting for each other and for the future of their species. Every time a shield generator failed, they found a way to bypass it. Every time a hull breach occurred, they sealed it with whatever materials they had on hand. They were a collective of will, a singular entity of defiance that refused to be extinguished. As they neared the rift, a massive, dark shape began to emerge from the shadows of the sphere's interior. It was a ship, but unlike any human vessel. It was a jagged, obsidian shard, miles long and covered in a forest of weapon emplacements. It was the Hunter, the ancient predator that had destroyed the Precursors, drawn to the sphere by the signal they had inadvertently triggered. The Hunter's ship was a thing of nightmares, a cold, unfeeling machine designed for the sole purpose of annihilation. It fired a single, massive beam of dark energy that struck the Vanguard squarely on its aft quarter. The ship spun wildly, its engines failing and its systems going dark. Valerius was thrown from his seat, his head slamming against the deck. For a moment, everything went black. He drifted in a void of pain and confusion, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull, distant roar. Then he heard the voice of Aegis, faint but persistent. The AI was telling him that they were not dead yet. The Vanguard had taken a hit that would have destroyed any other ship, but its rugged, redundant design had saved them. The core was still stable, and they had enough power for one final, desperate move. Valerius pulled himself back into the command chair, his vision blurring and blood trickling down his face. He looked at the bridge crew, most of whom were injured or unconscious. He looked at the Hunter's ship, which was closing in for the final kill. And then he looked at the rift, which was pulsing with a frantic, unstable light. He knew what he had to do. He ordered Aegis to channel all remaining power, including the life support and the emergency batteries, into the forward thrusters and the main deflector dish. He was going to ram the rift, using the ship's own kinetic energy and the dish's field to widen the opening and punch through to the other side. It was a suicidal maneuver, a one-in-a-million shot that would likely end with the Vanguard being torn apart by the gravitational forces, but it was their only chance. He gave the order, and the Vanguard surged forward, a tiny, defiant speck of light against the overwhelming darkness of the Hunter. As they hit the rift, the world exploded into a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds, a symphony of destruction and rebirth. And then there was nothing but the long, cold embrace of the stars. The Vanguard emerged into normal space, hundreds of light years away from the Dyson sphere. The ship was a wreck, its hull scarred and its systems barely functioning, but it was intact. They had survived. Valerius looked out at the familiar constellations of the human-occupied territories, a sense of relief washing over him that was so intense it was almost painful. They had seen the heights of alien technology and the depths of ancient terror, and they had come back to tell the tale. They had proven that humanity, with all its flaws and its stubbornness, was a force to be reckoned with. They were the children of Earth, the heirs to a legacy of survival that stretched back to the beginning of time. They had faced the void and refused to blink. As the crew began the long, arduous process of repairing the ship and tending to the wounded, Valerius sat in the quiet of the bridge, watching the distant lights of home. He knew that their journey was far from over. The Hunter was still out there, and the secrets of the Precursors were still waiting to be uncovered. But for now, they were safe. They had won a victory, not of technology or of power, but of the human spirit. And in the vast, indifferent expanse of the universe, that was the greatest victory of all. The return to the inner systems was not the triumphant parade the crew might have imagined in their rarer moments of vanity. Instead, the Vanguard of Sol limped through the vacuum like a wounded predator, its once pristine hull scorched to a dull, charcoal gray, and its structural ribs groaning with every pulse of the auxiliary thrusters. Valerius Thorne stood in the center of the engineering bay, his uniform jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled to the elbows. The air here was even thicker than on the bridge, heavy with the smell of burnt insulation and the sharp, ozone tang of arcing electricity. Sarah was buried waist-deep in a junction box, her movements frantic yet precise as she bypassed a fried power coupling. They were 4 days out from the nearest deep space outpost, and the ship was currently holding together through a combination of jury-rigged patches and sheer mechanical spite. The silence of the engineering bay was broken only by the rhythmic clanging of a loose floor plate and the steady, low-frequency hum of the life support backup. Every member of the crew was pushed to the brink of exhaustion, their faces gaunt under the harsh flickering of the emergency lights, yet no one complained. This was the human condition in the deep black. Survival was a labor of calloused hands and stubborn minds. Valerius watched Sarah as she emerged from the machinery, her face streaked with hydraulic fluid. She looked at him with eyes that were bloodshot but burning with a fierce intensity. She reported that the primary reactor was stable at 40%, enough to maintain a steady crawl, but nowhere near enough for a slipspace jump if the Hunter or its scouts found them again. The data they had extracted from the Precursor sphere was currently partitioned within a lead-shielded physical drive, disconnected from the ship's main network to prevent any residual alien code from compromising their remaining systems. Valerius nodded, acknowledging the necessity of the precaution. That drive contained the coordinates of the Dyson sphere, the history of a fallen empire, and the terrifying profile of the entity that had ended it. It was the most valuable and dangerous object in human history. He felt the weight of it in his mind, a psychic anchor that reminded him of the fragility of their entire species. If the United Terran hegemony received this data, It would spark a technological revolution, but it would also paint a target on every human colony in the quadrant. In the medbay, the atmosphere was more somber. Commander Jackson sat on the edge of a diagnostic bed, his arm encased in a transparent gel sleeve that was slowly knitting torn muscle fibers back together. He was watching over his squad, those who had survived the chaotic retreat from the sphere's surface. The medical staff, led by a stern woman named Elena, moved between the beds with quiet efficiency. There were no songs of bravery here, only the soft hiss of automated injectors and the low murmurs of soldiers recounting the shadows they had seen moving in the alien city. Jackson looked up as Valerius entered, his expression hardening. He spoke of the efficiency of the hunter's ship, the way it had appeared out of the dark like a ghost made of obsidian. It had not hailed them, had not issued demands. It had simply begun the process of erasure. This was a concept difficult for the human mind to grasp, an enemy that lacked even the common ground of hostility, treating life merely as a nuisance to be scrubbed away. Valerius sat beside his old friend, feeling the cold vibration of the ship through the deck. They both knew that the Vanguard was a pioneer, but they had inadvertently become sentinels, the first line of defense against a threat they were wholly unprepared to fight. The science officer, a man named Thomas, who had replaced the injured Kale in the immediate rotation, approached Valerius with a grim update. He had been analyzing the sensor echoes captured during their exit from the rift. The energy signature of the hunter's vessel was unlike anything in the hegemony databases. It didn't use fusion or antimatter in any way they understood. It seemed to draw energy from the vacuum itself, a process that left a trail of dead space in its wake where even background radiation was suppressed. Thomas explained that the hunter was likely following the signal the Dyson sphere had emitted, but it was also capable of tracking the specific warp wake of the Vanguard. They weren't just running, they were being scented. Valerius took the tablet from Thomas, looking at the visual reconstruction of the obsidian shard. It was a jagged, cruel design, devoid of the grace found in the Precursor architecture. It was a weapon in the shape of a ship. He ordered Thomas to work with Aegis to find a way to mask their wake, even if it meant venting precious coolant to create a thermal decoy. Every minute they bought was a minute closer to the safety of the hegemony's border forts. As the ship reached the edge of the Uit cloud of a nameless red dwarf system, the long-range sensors finally pinged a friendly signature. It was a picket ship, the Cavalier, a fast-attack frigate patrolling the fringes of human space. The relief that swept through the bridge was palpable, a collective exhalation that seemed to soften the very edges of the metal consoles. Valerius took the command chair, smoothing his uniform as best he could. The communication link was grainy, distorted by the damage to the Vanguard's external arrays, but the voice that came through was unmistakably human. The captain of the Cavalier was confused, demanding to know why a deep space exploration vessel was returning from the silent reaches in such a state of ruin. Valerius kept his report brief and coded, stating only that they had encountered a Tier 0 planetary anomaly and required immediate escort to the nearest high-security naval yard. He didn't mention the Dyson sphere or the hunter over an open channel. Some secrets were too heavy for the airwaves. The Cavalier moved into a flanking position, its sleek, predatory lines a sharp contrast to the battered bulk of the Vanguard. Seeing the frigate's railgun turrets and missile pods gave Valerius a momentary sense of security, but it was a fleeting one. He knew that the Cavalier, for all its firepower, would be little more than a paper shield against the obsidian shard they had left behind. The two ships began the slow process of synchronized navigation toward the sector command hub at Station Aurelia. During the transit, Valerius retreated to his ready room, a small, utilitarian space filled with physical books and a single, low-power terminal. He began the task of drafting his official report, trying to find words for the scale of what they had seen. How did one describe a city that encompassed a star? How did one quantify the dread of an ancient predator? He wrote about the resilience of his crew, about Sarah's ingenuity and Jackson's courage. He realized that while the technology of the precursors was magnificent, it was the messy, imperfect, and unyielding nature of humanity that had allowed them to escape it. The precursors had built a perfect world and vanished. Humans lived in a broken one and endured. Station Aurelia appeared on the monitors as a massive, rotating wheel of steel and light, anchored to a jagged asteroid in the heart of a vibrant nebula. It was a hub of industry and military might, the gateway to the core worlds. As the Vanguard was guided into a secure docking cradle, Valerius felt a strange sense of displacement. The station was bustling with life, with trade ships and passenger liners moving in a choreographed dance of commerce. The people there were worried about fuel prices, cargo manifests, and the latest political squabbles in the hegemony Senate. They had no idea that the horizon had just shifted, that the universe had suddenly become much smaller and much more dangerous. Valerius was met at the airlock by a contingent of high-ranking naval officers and intelligence agents. Their faces were masks of professional neutrality, but their eyes were sharp with curiosity. They took the data drive with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. Valerius was escorted to a secure debriefing room, leaving his ship behind for the first time in 3 years. The debriefing lasted for 18 hours. Valerius sat at a long, polished table, facing a panel of admirals and scientists who picked apart every second of the mission. They watched the sensor logs, the shaky helmet cam footage of the alien plaza, and the final, desperate ramming of the rift. Some were skeptical, questioning the possibility of a Dyson sphere so close to their borders remaining undetected for so long. Others were terrified, already calculating the defensive requirements of a war against a Tier 0 entity. Valerius answered every question with a flat, tired honesty. He didn't try to embellish the story. The reality was more than enough. He told them that the hunter was not a legend, but a physical reality that was now aware of humanity's existence. He emphasized that the Dyson sphere was failing and that the technology within was likely the only thing that could give them a fighting chance. By the end of the session, the room was silent. The weight of the discovery had settled over the leadership of the hegemony like a shroud. While Valerius was sequestered, the crew of the Vanguard was being processed through isolation and medical evaluation. Sarah was seen arguing with a technician who wanted to dismantle her jury-rigged power couplings for study. She defended her work with the ferocity of a mother protecting a child, claiming that the station's standard protocols would have seen the ship drift into a sun days ago. Jackson was quieter, sitting in a recovery ward and staring at the wall. He had seen the way the hunter's beams had sliced through reinforced plating as if it were parchment. He knew that the weapons they currently possessed were toys in comparison. This was the burden of the soldier, to know exactly how outmatched they were and to prepare to fight anyway. Even among the civilian workers on the station, rumors began to spread. Stories of a ghost ship returning from the void, of a crew that had seen the face of God and found it cold. The atmosphere on Aurelia shifted from one of routine to one of suppressed tension, an electric charge in the air that signaled the end of an era. Late that night, Valerius was finally allowed to return to his quarters on the station. It was a sterile, windowless room, far more comfortable than his cabin on the ship, yet he found he couldn't sleep. He stood in front of a small mirror, looking at the gray in his hair and the new lines around his eyes. He thought about the people of Earth, the billions who lived their lives in the warm glow of Sol, unaware of the obsidian shard moving through the dark. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness for them. Humanity was a loud, chaotic, and often violent species, but they were also a species of builders, dreamers, and survivors. They had survived the Great Winter, the Gene Wars, and the first stumbling steps into the vacuum. They were not ready to be erased. He sat at the desk and pulled up a star chart of the hegemony, looking at the scattered dots of light that represented human colonies. They were so small, so isolated in the vastness of the galaxy. But then he looked at the data he had brought back, the glimpses of precursor knowledge that Sarah and Thomas were already beginning to decrypt. The decryption was revealing things that defied conventional science. The precursors hadn't just mastered gravity, they had mastered the underlying code of the universe. They had found ways to fold space like paper and to harvest the zero-point energy of the vacuum itself. The data suggested that the Dyson sphere was just one of many such structures, a network of sanctuaries designed to preserve the sum total of sentient knowledge. More importantly, it contained the blueprints for a localized gravitational disruptor, a weapon that could, in theory, collapse the shields of a hunter ship by destabilizing the very space it occupied. It was a glimmer of hope, a narrow path through the darkness. But the materials required to build such a device were rare, found only in the volatile hearts of nebulae or the deep crusts of dead worlds. It would require a mobilization of the hegemony's resources unlike anything seen since the expansion eras. It would require the entire species to work as one, a feat that had always been humanity's greatest challenge. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah, her face scrubbed clean but her eyes still weary. She had been granted special clearance to continue working on the Vanguard's core with the station's research team. She told him that they had found something else in the data, a hidden message embedded in the very structure of the crystalline library. It wasn't a manual or a history book. It was a testament. The precursors had known they were being hunted, and they had known they would lose. They hadn't built the sphere as a fortress, but as a seed. They were waiting for a species with the grit to find it, the strength to survive the encounter with the hunter, and the ingenuity to use what they had left behind. They had been waiting for a species like humanity. Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, the weight of the realization hitting her. They weren't just lucky survivors, they were the chosen heirs of a legacy they didn't yet understand. Valerius looked at her, then back at the star chart. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by something else, a cold, hard resolve. They would not just wait for the hunter to find them. They would rebuild the Vanguard, or they would build something even better. They would take the fire of the precursors and forge it into a sword. The hegemony would have to change, to move away from the comfort of the inner systems and back into the dangerous, beautiful unknown. Valerius knew the path ahead would be paved with sacrifice, that many of the people he cared for would not see the end of it. But that was the price of survival. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the station's docking ring where the Vanguard sat, its silhouette dark against the glowing nebula. It looked like a relic, a piece of ancient iron, but it was still standing. And as long as one human vessel was still standing, the species was still in the fight. He turned to Sarah and told her to get some rest, because tomorrow they were going to start work on a new kind of ship. A ship that wouldn't just endure the darkness, but would drive it back. The next morning, the Hegemony Council issued a general mobilization order. It was masked as a response to shifting geopolitical tensions in the frontier sectors. But the true reason was clear to anyone who saw the massive transport ships being diverted to the naval yards. The Vanguard was moved to a high-security dry dock, where a small army of engineers began the process of stripping it down to the frame. They were going to integrate the first of the precursor-derived systems, a new reactor core, and a prototype gravitational hull. Valerius was given command of a new task force designated Project Resurgence. His mission was to return to the Silent Reaches, not as an explorer, but as a surveyor. They needed to find more precursor sites, more seeds left in the dark, before the hunter found them first. He looked at the list of officers assigned to him, seeing the familiar names of Sarah, Jackson, and Thomas. They were the core, the steel at the center of the new endeavor. They were the ones who had seen the rift and come back, and they were the only ones who knew exactly what was at stake. As the first of the new components were lowered into the Vanguard's waiting chassis, Valerius stood on the observation gantry, watching the sparks of the welding torches. Each spark was a small, temporary light in the gloom, a tiny defiance against the cold vacuum. He thought about the precursors, sitting in their amber city and waiting for the end. They had been a great civilization, perhaps the greatest the galaxy had ever seen, but they had lacked the one thing that humanity had in abundance, the inability to accept defeat. The precursors had sought harmony and found silence. Humans sought struggle and found life. The war ahead would be long, and it would be brutal, but Valerius Thorne felt a strange, grim sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly why he was born. He was a human, and he was here to ensure that the light of his kind did not go out. He watched the ship take shape, a fusion of old iron and alien light, and he knew that the hunter was in for a surprise. The universe was no longer empty, and it was no longer quiet. Humanity had arrived, and they weren't going anywhere. The dry docks of Station Aurelia were a hive of controlled chaos, illuminated by the rhythmic, flickering blue of plasma torches and the steady amber glow of industrial lifters. The Vanguard of Sol was no longer the ship that had limped home from the Silent Reaches. It was becoming something hybrid and fierce. Its original titanium-reinforced hull was being overlaid with shimmering plates of a precursor-derived alloy that seemed to swallow the ambient light. Valerius Thorne stood on the pressurized observation catwalk, his boots vibrating with the deep, subsonic thrum of the station's heavy machinery. Below him, Sarah was directing a team of specialized technicians as they lowered the new power core into the ship's primary engineering trunk. The core was a containment housing for a stabilized singularity fragment, a piece of technology reverse-engineered from the data crystals they had retrieved. It didn't burn fuel in the traditional sense. It harvested the tension between dimensions, providing a power output that eclipsed the ship's old fusion reactors by several orders of magnitude. Valerius watched the delicate operation with a mixture of pride and unease. They were playing with the fundamental forces of the universe, stitching alien miracles onto a frame built for much simpler purposes. The transformation of the ship was mirrored by the transformation of the crew. Jackson had traded his standard security fatigues for a prototype kinetic absorption suit, its surface a matte black weave designed to harden instantly upon impact. He spent his hours in the station's combat simulators, training his squads to fight in environments where gravity was a variable and walls were merely suggestions. The data from the Dyson sphere had suggested that the hunter's boarders didn't use projectile weapons. They used phased energy blades and localized spatial distortions. Human soldiers had to learn to move and strike in ways that defied their biological intuition. Valerius often visited the training bays, watching as men and women practiced high-speed maneuvers in zero-G, their movements becoming fluid and predatory. They weren't just preparing for a boarding action, they were preparing for a clash of civilizations. There was a grim intensity in the air, a shared understanding that the era of peaceful exploration had ended the moment they crossed the rift. Every person on the Vanguard knew they were the experimental vanguard of a species that refused to be a footnote in galactic history. Thomas, the science officer, had moved his base of operations into a high-security lab on the station, where he worked alongside the hegemony's top theoretical physicists. They were obsessed with the dead space wake left by the obsidian shard. By analyzing the sensor logs, they had discovered that the hunter didn't travel through slipspace or warp. It moved by folding the vacuum, essentially erasing the distance between 2 points. This was why it appeared so suddenly and why it was so difficult to track. Thomas was developing a countermeasure, a localized gravity well generator that could unfold the space around the Vanguard, forcing any nearby vessel into real space. It was a theoretical shield that could turn a ghost into a target. Valerius reviewed the progress reports every morning, noting the staggering cost in resources and lives. 3 technicians had already been lost to laboratory accidents involving spatial fluctuations. In the pursuit of survival, humanity was paying a price in blood before the first shot of the new war was even fired. As the weeks turned into months, the political climate of the United Terran hegemony began to fracture under the weight of the mobilization. Some senators argued that the Vanguard's report was a fabrication, a play for military funding, or a collective hallucination caused by deep space psychosis. Others believed the threat was real, but argued for a policy of isolationism, suggesting they should collapse the jump gates and hide within the inner systems. Valerius was called to testify before the High Council multiple times, his steady, unwavering voice a stark contrast to the panicked bickering of the politicians. He didn't offer theories, he offered the scars on his ship and the cold, hard data of the Precursor library. He told them that hiding was an illusion. The hunter had followed the Precursors across the stars. It would not be deterred by a few thousand light-years of empty space. Humanity had 2 choices. They could wait to be erased in the comfort of their homes, or they could meet the threat in the dark with weapons they were only beginning to understand. His testimony eventually swung the vote, securing the final tranche of credits needed to complete the Vanguard's refit. The day of the ship's relaunch was a quiet affair, devoid of the fanfare that usually accompanied naval commissions. The Vanguard was towed out of the drydock by a fleet of tugs, its new hull shimmering with a faint, iridescent sheen. It looked less like a ship and more like a jagged spearhead forged from the heart of a fallen star. Valerius stood on the bridge, which had been completely redesigned. The old tactile interfaces were gone, replaced by neural-link consoles and holographic displays that projected a 360-degree view of the surrounding space. Aegis, the ship's intelligence, had been integrated into the new Precursor-derived processors, its personality now sharper and more complex. It spoke to Valerius through a direct neural interface, its voice a constant, cool presence in the back of his mind. The ship felt alive in a way it never had before, a synthesis of human iron and alien thought. As the primary engines flared to life, a brilliant, violet exhaust that left no trail, Valerius felt a surge of adrenaline. They were no longer the hunted, they were the seekers. Their first mission was to return to the Silent Reaches, specifically to a set of coordinates Thomas had extracted from a secondary data crystal. These coordinates pointed to a precursor foundry world, a planet-sized factory designed to harvest the heavy elements of a gas giant's core. If the hegemony was to build a fleet of ships like the Vanguard, they needed the materials only a foundry could provide. The journey was a test of the new engines. Instead of weeks, the transit took only days. The Vanguard moved through the vacuum with a terrifying grace, its gravitational hull smoothing the wrinkles of spacetime. Inside, the crew felt nothing of the immense speeds. The inertial dampeners were so effective that the ship felt as stable as a planet. Valerius spent the time walking the decks, talking to his officers and crew. He found Sarah in the machine shop, tinkering with a portable version of the gravity well generator. She looked tired, but there was a spark of excitement in her eyes. She told him that the precursor tech wasn't just advanced, it was intuitive. It felt like it was designed to be found and mastered. Upon arriving at the Foundry world, the crew was greeted by a sight of industrial majesty. The planet, a massive gas giant named Ophiuchus Prime, was encircled by a ring of metallic structures that spanned thousands of miles. These structures were connected by massive tethers that descended deep into the planet's atmosphere, where they harvested the metallic hydrogen and other rare elements from the core. The Foundry was still active, its automated systems humming with the power of a captured moon. However, as the Vanguard approached, the sensors picked up a familiar signature. An obsidian shard was already there, tethered to one of the Foundry's primary docking spires. It was smaller than the ship they had encountered at the Dyson sphere, but it was unmistakably a hunter vessel. It was feeding, its dark hull pulsing as it siphoned energy and materials from the Precursor station. Valerius felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his chest. The hunter wasn't just an apex predator, it was a parasite, living off the remains of the civilizations it destroyed. He ordered the ship to battle stations. The bridge lights dimmed to a tactical crimson, and the holographic displays zoomed in on the enemy vessel. Jackson's security teams took their positions in the boarding craft, while Sarah and the engineering crew stabilized the power flow to the new weapons systems. The Vanguard had been equipped with a prototype spatial lance, a weapon that projected a narrow beam of intense gravitational force capable of shearing through matter at a molecular level. It was an unproven weapon, a theory made manifest in steel and energy. Valerius watched the obsidian shard as it detached from the spire, its jagged form turning toward them with a slow, predatory deliberation. It didn't broadcast a challenge, it simply fired. A beam of dark energy lashed out, striking the Vanguard's new shields. The ship shuddered, but the iridescent hull held firm. The precursor alloy absorbed the energy, dispersing it across the entire surface of the ship. It was the first time a human vessel had taken a direct hit from a hunter and remained functional. "Return fire," Valerius commanded, his voice a low growl. The spatial lance groaned as it drew power from the Singularity core. A beam of distorted light erupted from the Vanguard's prow, striking the obsidian shard squarely in its center. The effect was instantaneous. The space around the hunter ship buckled and twisted, and the obsidian hull cracked like glass. Fragments of the alien vessel were pulled into the gravitational vortex, disappearing into the void. The shard drifted, its power failing and its systems sputtering. It was a victory, but it was not the end. Two more obsidian shards emerged from the shadows of the Foundry ring, their movements synchronized and lethal. They had walked into another trap, or perhaps the hunter was simply more numerous than they had dared to hope. Valerius didn't hesitate. He ordered the ship to dive into the atmosphere of the gas giant, using the intense pressure and the turbulent storms to mask their movements. The Vanguard descended into the swirling clouds of Ophiuchus Prime, the hull groaning as the atmospheric pressure mounted. Outside the viewports, the world was a chaotic tapestry of orange and gold, with lightning bolts the size of continents arcing between the clouds. The hunter ships followed, their obsidian hulls glowing red as they fought the friction. Valerius watched the sensor displays, looking for an opportunity. He knew they couldn't win a direct engagement against two of them, even with their new weapons. He needed to use the environment to his advantage. He directed the ship toward a massive, permanent cyclone near the planet's equator, a storm that had been raging for millions of years. The gravity within the cyclone was intense enough to crush a standard ship, but the Vanguard's new hull was built for this. As they entered the eye of the storm, Valerius ordered Thomas to activate the gravity well generator. The generator pulsed, creating a localized pocket of stable space within the heart of the cyclone. The two hunter ships, caught in the unfolding spatial distortion and the immense pressure of the storm, began to lose their structural integrity. One of them was caught by a massive updraft and slammed into a floating mountain of frozen ammonia, its obsidian hull shattering into a million pieces. The other struggled to maintain its orientation, its engines coughing out clouds of dark energy. Valerius saw his chance. He ordered the Vanguard to rise out of the cyclone and deliver a final blow with the spatial lance. The beam struck the second shard's engine core, triggering a massive explosion that lit up the clouds for hundreds of miles. The threat was neutralized. The Vanguard ascended back into the vacuum, its hull scarred but its spirit unbroken. They had faced 3 of the predators and emerged victorious. The crew spent the next several days surveying the foundry. They found that while the hunter had been siphoning energy, it hadn't managed to access the core data of the facility. Sarah and Thomas were able to interface with the foundry's primary AI, a being of vast and ancient intelligence that recognized the Vanguard's precursor signatures. The foundry agreed to begin production of the materials the hegemony needed, provided the humans could provide the defense. It was a symbiotic relationship. Humanity provided the will and the protection, while the precursor legacy provided the means. Valerius sent a message back to Station Aurelia, detailing the victory and the discovery. He knew that this was just the beginning. They had found a source of power, but they had also drawn the attention of the wider hunter fleet. The obsidian shards they had destroyed were likely just scouts, a tiny fraction of the force that was coming. As he stood on the bridge, watching the foundry's massive tethers reach down into the gas giant, Valerius thought about the nature of the war they were in. It wasn't a war for territory or for resources. It was a war for the right to exist. The hunter represented the heat death of the universe, a cold, entropic force that sought to bring everything to a state of perfect, silent nothingness. Humanity, with its noise, its heat, and its relentless drive to grow, was the ultimate antithesis to that force. They were the fire that burned in the dark, and they would not be extinguished. He felt a deep sense of connection to his crew, to the people of the hegemony, and even to the long-dead precursors. They were all part of a single, continuous story of life pushing back against the void. He looked at the stars, no longer seeing them as distant, cold lights, but as the battleground where the future of all sentient life would be decided. The Vanguard began its patrol of the Foundry Ring, its sensors scanning for any sign of the hunter's return. The atmosphere on the ship had changed. The fear that had once clouded the eyes of the crew had been replaced by a quiet, professional confidence. They knew they could fight, and they knew they could win. Valerius took a moment to sit in his command chair, closing his eyes for the first time in 48 hours. He could hear the soft hum of the Singularity Core, the rhythmic pulse of the life support, and the quiet murmurs of the bridge crew. It was the sound of humanity at work, a sound that had echoed across the ages. He knew that the challenges ahead would be greater than anything they had faced so far, but he was ready. They were the vanguard, and they would lead the way. The foundry ring of Ophiuchus Prime was not merely a factory. It was a cathedral of industry that vibrated with the literal pulse of the gas giant below. For weeks, the Vanguard of Sol maintained a high orbital watch, its new iridescent hull catching the flickering lightning from the storms below like a predator's eye. Inside the ship, the atmosphere had shifted from the frantic energy of a refit to the grinding, professional tension of an occupational force. Sarah had established a permanent engineering camp on the primary docking spire of the foundry, working alongside the ancient automated systems to recalibrate the assembly lines. The Precursor AI, a consciousness that manifested as a series of shifting geometric light patterns in the spire's central hub, had begun to communicate more fluently. It identified itself through a linguistic construct that translated roughly to the Weaver. The Weaver did not possess emotions as humans understood them, but it exhibited a logical preference for continued operation over entropy. It processed the materials harvested from the planet's core, metallic hydrogen, exotic silicates, and stable isotopes of transuranic elements, and fed them into the massive 3D printing arrays that span the ring's inner circumference. Valerius Thorne spent much of his time on the spire, walking the transparent corridors that looked out over the assembly bays. He watched as the first sovereign-class hulls began to take shape. These were not the bulky, utilitarian blocks of the old hegemony fleet. They were sleek, aggressive designs based on the Vanguard's hybrid architecture. Each ship would be equipped with a singularity core and a spatial lance, turning the human navy from a defensive shield into a localized gravitational hammer. However, the Weaver provided a warning that Thomas and the science team were struggling to quantify. The Hunter was not a single species or a single fleet. It was a collective intelligence, a vast network of obsidian shards that shared a singular entropic purpose. By destroying the 3 scouts in the atmosphere of Ophiuchus Prime, the Vanguard had signaled a sight of resistance to the collective. The response would not be another scout, it would be a harvesting fleet. Jackson and his security teams were not idle during the wait. They utilized the Foundry's vast, empty chambers to run live-fire exercises with the new kinetic absorption suits. The suits were now integrated with the ship's Aegis subroutines, allowing the soldiers to perceive spatial distortions seconds before they manifested. Jackson pushed his people to the point of collapse, knowing that the margin for error against the Hunter was non-existent. He had seen the way the obsidian borders moved, shifting through bulkheads as if the steel were liquid, striking with blades that bypassed traditional armor by severing the molecular bonds of the target. To counter this, Jackson's teams practiced entanglement tactics, using portable gravity anchors to pin the borders in real space before neutralizing them with high-frequency acoustic pulse rifles. The sound of the training, the rhythmic thud of the anchors, and the sharp, piercing whine of the pulse rifles became the constant background noise of the spire's barracks. The first true test of the Resurgence project came when the long-range sensor buoys Sarah had seeded in the outer system went dark. It wasn't a gradual failure. They were snuffed out one by one in a perfect radial pattern centered on the Foundry. Valerius was back on the bridge of the Vanguard within minutes, the neural link with Aegis snapping into place with a cold, familiar clarity. The holographic displays showed a massive distortion at the edge of the system, a fold in space so large that it caused the nearby stars to wobble in the visual spectrum. Out of that fold emerged the harvesting fleet. There were dozens of obsidian shards, ranging from the size of the Vanguard to massive, jagged dreadnoughts that eclipsed the Foundry's docking spires. They moved with a terrifying, silent coordination, fanning out to encircle the gas giant. They didn't target the ship first. They targeted the Foundry's tethers, seeking to cut the supply of materials and starve the human resistance. Valerius ordered the Vanguard to intercept the lead dreadnought, while the first 2 Sovereign-class prototypes, the Indomitable and the Relentless, were rushed into service. They were barely finished, their internal decks still smelling of sealant and ozone, and their crews consisted of the best survivors from the Vanguard's original mission. As the human ships moved to engage, the Weaver activated the Foundry's internal defenses. Massive beams of coherent violet light erupted from the ring, crossing the vacuum to strike the obsidian hulls. The battle was a chaotic symphony of light and shadow. The spatial lances of the human ships tore through the dark matter shields of the shards, while the hunters' beams carved deep furrows in the iridescent plating of the sovereign-class vessels. Valerius felt every impact through the neural link, a phantom pressure in his chest that he pushed aside with a practiced iron will. He directed the Vanguard into the heart of the enemy formation, using the ship's superior maneuverability to weave between the larger dreadnoughts. "Target their propulsion nodes," Valerius commanded, his voice broadcast across the task force's encrypted channel. "We can't destroy them all in a slugging match. We have to disrupt their coordination." The Vanguard fired its spatial lance, a beam of concentrated gravity that struck a hunter dreadnought's rear quadrant. The space around the node buckled, and the massive obsidian ship spun out of control, colliding with one of its own escorts. The resulting explosion was a silent, blinding flash of dark energy that sent ripples through the local gravity field. But for every shard they disabled, two more seemed to take its place. The hunter fleet was a tide of entropy, seemingly endless and utterly indifferent to its own losses. On the bridge, Thomas reported that the enemy was attempting to establish a localized stasis field around the foundry, a zone of absolute zero-point energy that would freeze the assembly lines and the people within them. Sarah, still on the spire, contacted Valerius via a high-bandwidth burst. She had a plan, but it was a desperate gamble that required the Vanguard to draw the entire fleet's attention. She had found a way to reverse the flow of the foundry's tethers. Instead of pulling metallic hydrogen up from the planet, they could pump high-intensity singularity energy down into the gas giant's core. This would trigger a massive, controlled solar flare from the planet itself, a localized supernova that would scour the surrounding space of anything not protected by a precursor gravitational shield. The Vanguard and the Sovereign ships had such shields. The Hunter shards, despite their advanced technology, relied on a different form of spatial manipulation that Sarah believed would be vulnerable to the flare's specific radiation frequency. Valerius didn't hesitate. He ordered the task force to form a defensive perimeter around the primary spire, drawing the Hunter fleet in closer. The obsidian shards, sensing a chance to eliminate the human leadership in a single strike, converged on the Vanguard. The sky around the ship was filled with the jagged silhouettes of the enemy, their dark energy beams lashing out with increasing ferocity. The Vanguard's shields were screaming, the iridescent hull glowing a dangerous, brilliant white as it struggled to dissipate the energy. Inside, the deck plates were bucking, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched electronics. Valerius watched the countdown on his display, his hand hovering over the command to brace. In the medbay, Elena and her staff were already working on the first wave of casualties, their hands steady despite the ship's violent tremors. "Now," Valerius shouted. On the spire, Sarah slammed the final override. The tethers of the foundry ring turned a blinding, translucent purple as gigawatts of raw singularity energy were dumped into the heart of Ophiuchus Prime. For a second, there was a profound, eerie silence. Then, the gas giant screamed. A massive column of fire and ionized gas erupted from the planet's equator, following the path of the tethers and expanding outward in a perfect, lethal disk. The flare hit the Hunter fleet like a physical wall. The obsidian shards, caught in the mid-frequency resonance of the flare, didn't just explode, they dissolved. Their dark matter hulls were stripped away in layers, the energy within them turning against itself. The dreadnoughts shattered into fine, obsidian dust that was swept away by the solar wind. The Vanguard and the Sovereign prototypes held their positions, their gravitational shields forming bubbles of calm within the inferno. Valerius watched the sensors as the Hunter fleet was erased from the tactical display. It was a victory of such magnitude that it felt unreal. The unbeatable predator had been undone by a species that had only discovered the existence of the Dyson sphere a few months prior. As the flare subsided and the gas giant settled back into its turbulent routine, the task force stood alone in the vacuum. The foundry was scorched, its outer structures pitted by the heat, but the core was intact. The Weaver pulsed a slow, rhythmic blue, a sign of approval, or perhaps just a reset of its internal logic. The cost, however, was high. The Relentless had taken a direct hit to its secondary reactor before the flare, and its crew was struggling to stabilize the ship. Dozens of people on the foundry spire had been blinded by the flash or injured by the violent structural shifts. Sarah was exhausted, her hands shaking as she shut down the tether systems. But as the survivors looked out at the empty space where the Hunter fleet had been, there was a sense of profound, transformative realization. They had not just survived, they had dictated the terms of the engagement. They had used the universe itself as a weapon. This was the true legacy of humanity, the ability to take a catastrophe and turn it into a tool. Valerius sat in his chair, the neural link slowly disconnecting. His mind felt raw, filled with the echoes of the ship's pain and the Weaver's ancient thoughts. He looked at Jackson, who had come up to the bridge, his black suit covered in the dust of the training bays. They didn't need words. They both knew that this was the first real battle of a long, terrible war. The Hunter would learn from this. It would adapt its frequencies, change its tactics, and return with a larger force. But humanity had also learned. They had learned that the Predator could bleed and that they had the steel to make it happen. Valerius looked at the stars, and for the first time, they didn't look like distant lights or a cold void. They looked like a frontier that was finally, stubbornly, theirs to defend. The aftermath of the orbital flare left the Ophiuchus system transformed. The gas giant's upper atmosphere remained a chaotic swirl of incandescent violet and bruised gold, a permanent scar on the planet's visage where the singularity energy had pierced its core. On the Vanguard of Sol, the silence of the corridors was no longer the silence of dread, but the heavy, rhythmic quiet of a crew that had looked into the abyss and seen it blink. Valerius Thorne sat in the tactical ready room, the holographic star chart of the surrounding sectors projected before him in a shimmering web of light. The Weaver had provided more than just industrial capacity. It had opened a window into the Hunter's movements across the local galactic arm. The data showed dozens of systems, once vibrant with the signals of alien civilizations, now reduced to cold zones, regions where the background radiation had been suppressed to near absolute zero. The Hunter was a gardener of entropy, pruning the universe of its heat and noise. Humanity was currently the loudest thing in the quadrant, a bonfire in a graveyard. Sarah entered the room, her hair tied back with a piece of frayed copper wire and her face smudged with the iridescent soot of the foundry's cooling ducts. She had been overseeing the repairs to the Relentless, which had nearly been torn apart by the spatial turbulence of the flare. She reported that the new Sovereign-class hulls were proving more resilient than their theoretical models had suggested. The Precursor AL didn't just resist damage, it seemed to remember its shape, slowly knitting microscopic fractures together when exposed to the radiation of the Singularity core. However, she also brought a warning. The energy output required to trigger the planetary flare had depleted the Foundry's primary capacitors. They were vulnerable. If the Hunter sent another harvesting fleet before the ring could recharge, they wouldn't have the luxury of a solar-scale weapon. They would have to rely on the steel of their ships and the grit of their pilots. Jackson joined them, his expression as unyielding as the kinetic absorption suit he still wore. He had been reviewing the combat logs from the boarding actions during the battle. While the Vanguard had held the line in space, several small obsidian splinters had managed to penetrate the Foundry's outer skin. His teams had engaged them in the pressurized maintenance tunnels, and the results were sobering. The Hunter borders were not biological. They were semi-solid projections of phased matter, capable of ignoring standard gravity and passing through bulkheads. Human casualties in the tunnels had been high. Jackson argued that they couldn't just defend the ships. They had to find a way to strike at the heart of the collective intelligence. If the Hunter was a network, they needed to find the signal's origin. He pointed to a cluster of coordinates on the map, a region of space known as the Great Attractor, where the gravitational distortions were so intense that even the precursors had marked it as a forbidden zone. Thomas, the science officer, appeared on the holographic display from his lab on the spire. He had been cross-referencing the Weaver's historical archives with the sensor data from the Hunter's defeat. He believed that the obsidian shards were not independent vessels, but nodes of a singular, vast entity that resided within the high-gravity wells of the Great Attractor. The shards didn't have crews. They had manifestations of the collective will. This meant that every time they destroyed a shard, the collective learned, adapted, and grew more efficient. To win, they couldn't just fight a war of attrition. They had to deliver a systemic shock, a virus, either biological or digital, that could propagate through the Hunter's spatial folding network. The precursors had attempted this in the final days of their empire, but they had failed because they had sought a perfect solution. Humanity, Thomas suggested, had a different advantage: the ability to weaponize chaos and imperfection. Valerius looked at his team, the three individuals who had become the pillars of the human resistance. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, but he also saw the spark of a new, dangerous ambition. They were no longer just survivors. They were architects of a new era. He gave the order to prepare for a long-range jump. They wouldn't wait for the next harvesting fleet to arrive at Ophiuchus Prime. Instead, they would take the Vanguard and the two functioning sovereign prototypes and head toward the Great Attractor. It was a journey into the heart of the enemy, a move so reckless that even the Weaver's logic circuits seemed to flicker in protest. But Valerius knew that the hegemony's only chance lay in the unexpected. The Hunter expected a defensive stand. It didn't expect a spear thrust at its throat. The transit to the Great Attractor was a grueling test of the new singularity engines. As they drew closer to the center of the galactic anomaly, space itself began to warp and groan. The stars outside the viewports were no longer points of light, but long, smeared streaks of color pulled toward the massive gravitational well at the heart of the sector. On the bridge of the Vanguard, the neural link was a constant roar of static in Valerius's mind. Aegis was working at maximum capacity just to keep the ship from being crushed by the tidal forces. The crew moved in a slow-motion dance, their bodies weighed down by the fluctuating gravity. In the medbay, Elena was treating cases of spatial vertigo, a condition where the human inner ear couldn't reconcile the ship's artificial gravity with the massive external pull of the attractor. Yet the work continued. Every bolt was tightened, every circuit checked. As they emerged from the final jump, they found themselves in a region of space that defied all human understanding. The Great Attractor was not a single object, but a swirling vortex of matter and energy, a cosmic drain where suns were stripped of their outer layers and pulled into a central singularity of impossible density. And there, orbiting the event horizon in a stable but precarious dance, was the Hunter's Nest. It was a structure made of the same obsidian material as the shards, but on a scale that dwarfed the Dyson sphere. It looked like a jagged, black thorn, thousands of miles long, rooted in the very fabric of space-time. Thousands of obsidian shards swarmed around it like insects, their movements perfectly synchronized. It was the heart of the hive, the source of the entropy that was slowly silencing the galaxy. "Launch the decays," Valerius commanded. The indomitable and the relentless moved to the flanks, deploying a cloud of high-intensity thermal and gravitational drones. These drones were designed to mimic the signature of a much larger fleet, drawing the swarm of obsidian shards away from the Vanguard. The plan was simple and suicidal. While the sovereign ships provided a distraction, the Vanguard would use its prototype spatial drill to punch a hole in the nest's outer shell. Jackson and his elite security teams would then board the structure, carrying a logic bomb designed by Thomas, a piece of recursive, contradictory code that would overload the hunter's collective consciousness. It was a digital poison for a being of pure order. The battle began with a silent, blinding fury. The hunter swarm reacted instantly to the decays, thousands of shards peeling away from the nest to engage the phantom fleet. The indomitable and the relentless fired their spatial lances, carving paths through the obsidian clouds, but the sheer numbers were overwhelming. The human ships were being pelted by beams of dark energy, their iridescent shields flickering under the strain. On the Vanguard, Valerius pushed the engines to their absolute limit. The ship surged forward, a silver needle aimed at the heart of the Black Thorn. The spatial drill, a focused beam of singularity energy, erupted from the prow, striking the nest's hull. For a moment, the obsidian resisted, the material absorbing the energy with a hungry efficiency. Then, the molecular bonds gave way. A jagged breach appeared, a glowing wound in the side of the nest. "Go, go, go," Jackson's voice echoed through the ship. The boarding craft, small, wedge-shaped vessels built for speed and impact, launched from the Vanguard's hangar. They streaked across the narrow gap and slammed into the breach, their magnetic anchors locking onto the alien interior. Inside the nest, the environment was a nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry and shifting shadows. Jackson led his team through corridors that seemed to stretch and shrink with every step. The air was cold, devoid of any moisture or scent. They encountered the first of the interior guards, manifestations of the collective that looked like suits of armor made of smoke and glass. The humans fought with a desperate, close-quarters ferocity, using their acoustic pulse rifles to shatter the smoky forms before they could solidify. Back on the Vanguard, Valerius watched the progress of the boarding team through a flickering holographic feed. The ship was under constant fire, the hull groaning as it absorbed hits that would have vaporized the old hegemony fleet. He could feel the ship's pain through the neural link, a sharp, metallic ache in his own nerves. Aegis reported that the Indomitable had lost its primary engines and was drifting toward the event horizon. He had to make a choice: stay and support the boarding team or break off to save his sister ship. "Hold the line," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He knew that if Jackson failed, there would be no one left to save. Jackson and his team reached the central chamber of the nest, a vast, hollow sphere filled with a pulsing, black liquid that seemed to contain the very essence of the hunter's consciousness. This was the hub, the point where all the nodes of the collective converged. Jackson set the logic bomb, a small, unassuming device filled with Thomas's chaotic code. As he activated the timer, the black liquid began to boil, sensing the intrusion. Massive, obsidian tentacles erupted from the pool, lashing out at the human soldiers. Jackson stood his ground, his kinetic suit absorbing the blows as he laid down a wall of pulse fire. "Package is live," he shouted. The retreat was a blur of violence and motion. The humans fought their way back to the boarding craft, leaving half their number behind in the cold, dark corridors of the nest. As the craft roared away from the breach and back toward the Vanguard, the logic bomb detonated. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but an explosion of data. The recursive code flooded the hunter's network, a cascade of contradictions and paradoxes that the collective's perfect logic couldn't resolve. The effect was immediate. Across the system, the obsidian shards began to falter. Their movements became erratic, their coordination shattered. Some turned on each other, while others simply went dark and began to drift into the singularity. The Vanguard snatched the boarding craft out of the air and turned its prow away from the great Attractor. Valerius ordered the ship to engage its jump engines, dragging the crippled indomitable and relentless with them in a massive, unstable warp bubble. As they crossed the threshold into slipspace, Valerius looked back at the obsidian Thorne. It was vibrating, its surface cracking as the internal logic failure began to manifest as physical instability. The heart of the hunter was breaking. They had done the impossible. They had wounded a god. The jump back to the Ophiuchus system was a journey through a tunnel of screaming light. When they finally emerged into the quiet orbit of the Foundry world, the crew was too exhausted to cheer. They had won, but the price was written on their faces. Jackson sat in the medbay, his suit torn and his hands trembling with adrenaline. Sarah was already back in engineering, trying to coax the failing Singularity core into one last cycle of power. Valerius stood on the bridge, the neural link slowly fading like a cooling ember. He looked at the casualty reports, the names of the men and women who would never see the home they had fought to protect. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars. The cold zones on the map were still there, but for the first time they weren't growing. The silence of the galaxy had been broken. Humanity had not just survived, they had changed the rules of the game. They were no longer a small, insignificant species hiding in the dark. They were the ones who had struck back, the ones who had found the weakness in the void. Valerius knew that the war wasn't over. The hunter was vast, and the nest at the great Attractor was likely only one of many, but they had proven it could be done. They had forged a path through the darkness, and they were ready to lead the way for anyone else who was still out there, hiding and waiting. The return to the Ophiuchus Foundry was not a homecoming of rest, but a transition into a state of permanent, galvanized readiness. The Vanguard of Sol hung in the shadow of the primary docking spire, its iridescent hull pitted and scarred from the gravitational shears of the great Attractor. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of medicinal tinctures and the sharp, dry aroma of ozone from the overworked life support processors. Valerius Thorne stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the long-range tactical overlay. The logic bomb had been more effective than Thomas had even dared to theorize. Across the local sector, the hunters' coordination had fractured into 1,000 disconnected, stuttering signals. The obsidian shards were no longer a unified tide. They were a collection of confused, predatory machines, and for the first time in an epoch, the hunter had become the prey. Sarah was deep in the bowels of the ship, her hands buried in the glowing filaments of the Singularity core. The engine was pulsing with a rhythmic, low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the very marrow of the crew's bones. She reported that the core was stabilizing, its internal geometry beginning to mimic the recursive patterns of the logic bomb they had detonated. The ship was evolving, its systems learning to process the chaotic data of the great Attractor. This was the final stage of the project, the creation of a resurgence fleet that could operate within the hunter's own spatial folds. The Weaver was working at maximum capacity, its assembly lines churning out new hulls that were smaller, faster, and infinitely more aggressive than the Sovereign prototypes. These were the Wraith-class interceptors, designed to hunt the hunters in the dark between the stars. Jackson spent his time in the medbay, sitting by the beds of the survivors from the boarding action. He had lost many good people in the black corridors of the nest, but those who remained had changed. They possessed a cold, quiet focus, a shared understanding of the enemy's nature that no simulation could ever provide. They were no longer just soldiers. They were the architects of a new kind of warfare. Jackson spoke to them about the next phase of the campaign. They wouldn't just be defending human space. They would be expanding outward, reclaiming the cold zones, and reigniting the stars that the Hunter had attempted to snuff out. The hegemony was no longer a collection of isolated colonies. It was becoming a galactic firebrand, a beacon of defiance for any other species that might still be hiding in the silence. The first signals from the wider galaxy began to arrive shortly after the Vanguard's return. They were faint, distorted by centuries of suppression, but they were unmistakably artificial. From the depths of the Perseus Arm, a series of mathematical pulses arrived, followed by a burst of high-bandwidth imagery showing a subterranean civilization that had survived the Hunter's harvest by retreating into the crusts of dead moons. From the galactic core, a rhythmic gravitational wave arrived, a signal from a collective of synthetic intelligences that had been waging a losing war of attrition for millennia. Humanity was no longer alone. Their victory at the Great Attractor had acted as a cosmic dinner bell, signaling to every survivor in the quadrant that the era of entropy was over. Valerius watched the signals populate the bridge displays, a sense of profound, humbling responsibility washing over him. They had started this fire, and now they had to ensure it didn't go out. Thomas, the science officer, had been analyzing the incoming signals with a feverish intensity. He believed that the Hunter's nest they had wounded was merely a local node, part of a much larger network that spanned the entire galaxy. To truly end the threat, they needed to synchronize the resistance. He proposed the creation of a galactic bastion, a network of precursor foundries, linked by the Vanguard's spatial folding technology that could provide a unified front against any further incursions. The Weaver agreed to provide the coordinates for other foundry worlds, but it warned that the Hunter Collective would eventually adapt to the logic bomb. Time was their most precious resource. They had a window of opportunity, a few years or perhaps a decade, to build a defense that could withstand the inevitable counterattack. The mobilization of the United Terran hegemony was now absolute. Every factory on Earth, every mining rig in the belt, and every research station in the outer colonies was dedicated to the war effort. The political bickering had vanished, replaced by a singular, focused will. The people of Sol were no longer afraid of the dark. They were the ones bringing the light. Massive transport ships, shielded by the first production line spatial lances, began to arrive at the Ophiuchus foundry, carrying millions of tons of raw materials and thousands of engineers. The ring was being expanded, its tethers reaching deeper into the gas giant to harvest the energy needed for the new fleet. Valerius saw the progress and felt a grim satisfaction. This was the true strength of humanity, the ability to turn a desperate struggle into a monumental achievement. The final chapter of the Vanguard's first mission came when Valerius took the ship on one last patrol of the system before the arrival of the new admiral who would take over the sector command. He stood on the observation deck, looking out at the gas giant. The violet scar was fading, but the planet would never be the same. Neither would he. He thought about the precursors, the beings who had built the Dyson sphere and the foundries, only to vanish into the long night. They had been masters of the physical universe, but they had lacked the one thing that defined humanity, the refusal to accept the inevitable. The precursors had sought a perfect silence. Humans had chosen the loud, messy, and beautiful struggle of life. Valerius knew that the road ahead would be paved with further sacrifice, and that the war for the galaxy was only just beginning. But as he looked at the stars, he didn't see enemies. He saw a legacy that was finally being claimed. Aegis chimed in his mind, its voice now a complex blend of human intuition and precursor logic. The AI reported that a new signal had been detected, originating from a star system only 50 light-years away. It wasn't a distress call, but a greeting. Another species had broken their silence, emboldened by the human victory. Valerius smiled, a thin, tired expression. "Set a course," he commanded. "Let's go meet our neighbors." The Vanguard turned its prow toward the distant light, its engines flaring with a brilliant violet fire that left no trail in the vacuum. The ship surged forward, crossing the threshold of the known and into the infinite possibilities of the new frontier. They were the children of Sol, the heirs to the precursors, and the protectors of the light. As the ship vanished into a spatial fold, the Ophiuchus system settled into a new kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a workshop at rest, the silence of a fortress before the dawn. The foundry ring continued to hum, its assembly lines producing the steel and the fire that would define the next 1,000 years of galactic history. The hunter was still out there, lurking in the deep wells of gravity and the cold pockets of the void, but it was no longer the master of the dark. The universe was no longer empty, and it was no longer silent. The fire of humanity had been lit, and it would burn until the very last star went dark. Valerius Thorne and his crew had led the way, and behind them, a galaxy was waking up, ready to fight for its right to exist. The story of the Vanguard of Sol was just the beginning of a larger narrative, a testament to the fact that ingenuity and resilience are the most powerful forces in the cosmos. Humanity had faced the ultimate entropy and refused to break. They had turned their scars into armor and their fear into a weapon. As they moved deeper into the stars, they carried with them the lessons of the Dyson sphere and the foundries, but more importantly, they carried the unyielding spirit of their home world. The dark was no longer a place of terror, it was a canvas for their ambition. And in the vast, indifferent expanse of the universe, that was the ultimate victory. The light of humanity would continue to shine, a defiant bonfire in the heart of the night, forever pushing back the shadows and claiming the stars as their own.